The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle, as Officer Thomas Bennet adjusted his bearskin hat for what felt like the 100th time that hour. His legs ached from standing perfectly still, and sweat trickled down his back despite the cool autumn breeze. Thomas had been a member of the Queen's Guard for 3 years now, and he took immense pride in his position. Every morning he woke up knowing that he was part of something bigger than himself, a tradition that stretched back centuries. Today was supposed to be like any other day. Thomas had arrived at dawn, put on his scarlet tunic and bearskin hat, and taken his position outside one of the castle's side entrances. This particular post was less visible to tourists, which Thomas actually preferred. The main gates attracted crowds of people trying to make the guards laugh or break their composure. But here, he could focus on his duty without constant distractions. Around mid-morning, Thomas heard the sound of small footsteps approaching. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded, but his peripheral vision caught sight of a small figure. It was Prince George, the young heir to the throne, dressed in casual clothes and walking alongside his nanny. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with sandy blonde hair that caught the sunlight. Thomas had seen the young prince before, of course. Windsor Castle was one of the royal family's primary residences, and it wasn't uncommon for members of the family to pass by the guards during their daily routines. The guards were trained to remain completely still and expressionless no matter who walked past. Thomas had stood motionless while the Queen herself had walked by, so a child shouldn't have been any different. But something unexpected happened that morning. As Prince George walked past Thomas's post, the boy suddenly stopped. His nanny continued walking for a few steps before realizing the prince had halted. She turned back with a questioning look on her face. Thomas remained frozen in place, his eyes staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. He could sense the young prince looking up at him, studying him with the curious intensity that only children possess. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Thomas's training kicked in automatically. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not acknowledge. Then Prince George did something that caught Thomas completely off guard. The boy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He looked up at Thomas's face once more, as if trying to determine something, then carefully placed the paper on the ground near Thomas's polished black boots. The action was deliberate and gentle, almost reverent. The nanny approached quickly, speaking in hushed tones. Your Royal Highness, we should continue with our walk. You mustn't disturb the guards. Prince George nodded but didn't move immediately. Instead, he stood there for another moment, looking up at Thomas with an expression that seemed far too mature for his age. There was something in the boy's eyes, a mixture of understanding and compassion that Thomas had rarely seen in adults, let alone children. Finally, the young prince turned and walked away with his nanny, their footsteps gradually fading into the distance. Thomas remained in position, his heart pounding in his chest. The folded paper sat on the ground near his feet, innocent and mysterious. Every fiber of his being wanted to look down at it, to pick it up and see what it said, but he couldn't. Not while on duty. Not while maintaining the centuries-old tradition of the Queen's Guard. The next hour was torture for Thomas. His mind raced with questions and possibilities. What had the prince written? Why had he left it specifically for Thomas? Was it a joke, a test, or something more meaningful? The paper seemed to burn with invisible fire, demanding his attention while his training demanded his stillness. Other guards had told stories about unusual encounters during their shifts, moments that tested their resolve or made them question their commitment to the strict protocols. One guard claimed a pigeon had once built a nest in his bearskin hat during a particularly long ceremony. Another swore that a celebrity had tried to bribe him with a substantial amount of money just to see him smile. But this felt different. This wasn't about maintaining composure in the face of provocation. This was about a young boy, a prince, reaching out with what seemed like genuine intention. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas's replacement finally arrived. The changing of the guard was performed with the usual precision and ceremony, even though this was a minor post without spectators. Thomas completed his duty, saluted his replacement, and marched away with measured steps. Only when he had turned the corner and was out of sight did he allow himself to break formation. His hands trembled slightly as he bent down and picked up the small folded paper. The quality was good, probably from the royal stationery, and it had been folded with care. Thomas looked around to make sure he was alone before carefully unfolding it. Inside, in a child's careful handwriting, were just a few simple words that would change everything Thomas thought he knew about duty, honor, and what truly mattered in life. The message was brief, but its impact was immediate and profound. The paper read, "My grandfather says you stand here every day protecting us, even when it's cold or hot or raining. He says you have to stand still even if your legs hurt. Thank you for being so brave. My mom says being brave is when you do hard things, even when nobody is watching. You're a real hero. Also, my little sister Charlotte dropped her toy horse behind the blue door yesterday, and she's been crying. Can you help? She's too shy to ask." Thomas read the words twice, then 3 times. His throat tightened with unexpected emotion. In all his years of service, he had received formal commendations and medals, had been praised by superior officers and thanked by politicians, but nothing had ever touched him quite like this simple note from a child. The part about the toy struck him particularly hard. While he had been standing at attention, maintaining his stoic facade and thinking about duty and tradition, a little girl had been upset about a lost toy. Something so small, so fixable, had been causing distress to a child just beyond the walls he protected. Thomas folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. He knew the protocols. He knew the rules. He knew that abandoning his post even after his shift to search for a child's toy was not part of his official duties. But as he stood there in the corridor, still in his full uniform, Thomas realized that something had shifted inside him. The young prince had seen him not as a statue, not as a symbol, not as a tourist attraction, but as a person who could help, a person who could make a difference in a small girl's life. Thomas stood in the corridor, still gripping the note in his pocket, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The bearskin hat felt heavier than usual on his head, and the scarlet tunic that had always filled him with pride now seemed to constrict his chest. He had been trained for years to follow orders without question, to maintain protocols that had been established long before he was born, and to never, ever deviate from his assigned duties. But the note had awakened something in him, a reminder that beneath the uniform and the ceremony, he was still just a man who could choose to help a crying child. Thomas made his way to the guardhouse where the other soldiers gathered between shifts. The room smelled of tea and boot polish, familiar scents that usually brought him comfort. Several of his fellow guards were there, some removing their heavy uniforms, others preparing for their next shift. They greeted him with the easy camaraderie that came from shared hardship and mutual respect. His closest friend among the guards was Michael Davies, a jovial man from Wales who had served for nearly a decade. Michael was sitting on a bench unlacing his boots with a groan of relief. "Rough shift?" he asked, noticing Thomas's distracted expression. Thomas hesitated. The note felt like a secret, something precious and private that shouldn't be shared casually. But he needed advice, and Michael was one of the few people he truly trusted. Without a word, Thomas pulled out the note and handed it to his friend. Michael read it slowly, his eyebrows rising with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Thomas with a mixture of amusement and concern. "The young prince wrote this to you?" Thomas nodded. "He left it at my post this morning. Just placed it on the ground and walked away." Michael handed the note back carefully as if it were made of delicate glass. "That's quite something. The lad's got a good heart, clearly. But Thomas, mate, you know you can't go searching the castle for a lost toy, right? That's not our job. We're guards, not nursemaids." The word stung, even though Thomas knew Michael meant no harm. "I know what our job is," Thomas said quietly. "I've stood at my post through rain, snow, and heat. I've maintained protocol even when tourists tried everything to distract me. I've never once broken formation or abandoned my duties." "Then why are you even considering this?" Michael asked, though his tone was gentle rather than judgmental. Thomas looked down at the note again, at the careful handwriting of a child who had taken the time to thank him for doing his job. "Because maybe there's more to being a guard than just standing still. Maybe protecting the royal family means more than just watching for physical threats." Michael sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I understand the sentiment. I really do. But if you go wandering around the castle searching for a toy, you could get in serious trouble. There are protocols for a reason. We don't have clearance to just explore wherever we want, even if our intentions are good." Thomas knew Michael was right from a practical standpoint. The castle had strict security measures, and guards were only permitted in certain areas during specific times. Wandering into restricted sections, even on a mission of kindness, could result in disciplinary action or worse. He could lose his position, the career he had worked so hard to build. But as he sat there in the guardhouse, surrounded by the trappings of military discipline and tradition, Thomas couldn't shake the image of a little girl crying over a lost toy. Princess Charlotte, who was probably no more than 6 or 7 years old, was somewhere in the castle upset about something that could be easily fixed if someone just took the time to care. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Thomas went through the motions of his duties, attending briefings and preparing equipment, but his mind was elsewhere. That evening, after he had changed into civilian clothes and was technically off duty, he found himself walking the grounds of the castle, looking for the blue door mentioned in the note. Windsor Castle was massive, with hundreds of rooms and dozens of doors. The blue door could be anywhere. Thomas walked through the areas he had access to, scanning the walls and corridors. Some doors were red, others brown or white. He found a few blue ones, but they were in public areas where a toy certainly would have been found and returned already. As dusk began to fall, Thomas realized he was running out of time and options. The castle would be closing for the night soon, and he needed to leave before security began their evening rounds. He felt frustrated and disappointed in himself. He had wanted to help, to prove that the prince's faith in him was justified. But he was failing at this simple task. Just as he was about to give up, Thomas noticed an older maintenance worker pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies. The man, who must have been in his 60s, had kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent working in the castle. Thomas approached him cautiously. "Excuse me, sir. I'm looking for a blue door. Probably in one of the family's private areas. Would you happen to know which one I mean?" The maintenance worker studied Thomas for a moment, taking in his guard's uniform pants and the earnest expression on his face. "There's a service entrance with a blue door near the east wing. Leads to one of the private gardens that the little ones like to play in." "But that's a restricted area, son. Guards aren't usually allowed back there unless specifically assigned." Thomas felt his heart sink. Of course the door would be in a restricted area. Nothing about this situation was going to be simple. "I understand," he said quietly. "Thank you anyway." The maintenance worker tilted his head, a knowing look crossing his face. "This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain young princess and a missing toy, would it?" Thomas's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know?" The older man chuckled softly. "I've worked here for 40 years, son. I see and hear things. The little princess was quite upset yesterday. Kept telling anyone who would listen about her beloved horse toy that fell somewhere she couldn't reach. Most of the staff didn't know what to do about it, since that door leads to a maintenance area we're not supposed to let the children near." Hope flickered in Thomas's chest. "Do you know where exactly the toy fell?" The maintenance worker glanced around, then leaned in closer. "Behind that blue door, there's a gap between the wall and an old storage cabinet. The toy probably slipped down there when she was playing nearby. But listen to me carefully, young man. If you go back there, you're breaking protocol. I can show you where it is, but what you choose to do with that information is your decision." Thomas stood at a crossroads. He could walk away right now, forget about the note and the toy, and return to his normal life as a disciplined guard who followed every rule to the letter. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice. Or he could take a risk, break protocol, and possibly face consequences for trying to help a child. The maintenance worker was watching him with patient, understanding eyes. "Sometimes, son, being a true guardian means caring for people, not just guarding them." There's a difference. Those words resonated deep in Thomas's chest. He thought about why he had joined the Queen's Guard in the first place. Yes, he had been drawn to the tradition and the honor, but underneath it all he had wanted to serve, to protect, to make a difference. Standing perfectly still was part of that service, but it wasn't the entirety of it. Thomas looked at the maintenance worker and made his decision. "Show me where the blue door is." A slight smile crossed the older man's weathered face. He nodded and gestured for Thomas to follow him. They walked through a series of corridors that became progressively quieter and less ornate. The public areas of Windsor Castle were grand and imposing, filled with priceless artwork and elaborate decorations. But these service corridors were plain and functional, the working arteries of the massive building that tourists never saw. The maintenance worker moved with the confidence of someone who had walked these halls thousands of times. He didn't speak as they walked, and Thomas was grateful for the silence. His heart was pounding, and he kept expecting someone to stop them, to demand what they were doing in this area. But the corridors remained empty. Finally, they turned a corner and the maintenance worker stopped. Ahead of them was a door painted a soft blue, slightly faded from age. It looked completely ordinary, the kind of door that people would walk past 100 times without noticing anything special about it. "There it is," the maintenance worker said quietly. "The gap is between the wall and a cabinet just inside and to the left. The toy should be wedged down there if nobody's moved it." He paused, then added, "I'll be continuing my rounds now. I didn't see you here and you didn't see me." "Understood?" Thomas nodded gratefully. "Thank you, sir, really." The older man waved a dismissive hand, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Just help the little one. That's thanks enough." He pushed his cart away, leaving Thomas alone in the corridor with the blue door. Thomas approached slowly, his hand reaching for the doorknob. It turned easily, unlocked. He pushed the door open gently, wincing as it creaked softly. Inside was a small storage area, dimly lit by a single window. Garden tools leaned against one wall and various supplies were stacked on shelves. To the left, exactly as described, was a tall wooden cabinet positioned slightly away from the wall. Thomas pulled out his phone and turned on its flashlight. He knelt down beside the cabinet and peered into the narrow gap. At first he saw nothing but dust and shadows. Then the light caught something, a small shape wedged far down in the space. He could just barely make out the form of a toy horse, one of those plastic figures that children loved with a pink mane and tail. The gap was too narrow for his hand to fit. Thomas lay flat on his stomach and stretched his arm as far as it would go, his fingers grasping at air. He was still several inches short. Frustration welled up inside him. He had come all this way, broken protocol, risked his position, and now he couldn't even reach the toy. He sat back on his heels and looked around the storage room for something he could use. There was a rake, but the handle was too thick. A broom had possibilities, but he would need something to hook the toy with. Then he spotted a wire coat hanger hanging on a nail. It wasn't ideal, but it might work. Thomas grabbed the hanger and quickly bent it into a long shape with a small hook at the end. He lay back down on the floor, ignoring the dust that was getting all over his uniform pants, and carefully inserted the wire into the gap. It took several attempts, each one more frustrating than the last. The wire would get close to the toy, then slip away. Once he almost had it hooked, but the toy tumbled further down into the darkness. Sweat dripped down Thomas's forehead as he concentrated. His arm ached from the awkward angle, and he was painfully aware that at any moment someone could walk in and find him there. What would he say? How would he explain why a Queen's Guard was lying on the floor of a storage room, fishing for a child's toy? But Thomas refused to give up. He adjusted the hook on the wire, making it slightly larger, and tried again. This time, when the hook caught the toy's mane, he moved very slowly and carefully. Inch by inch, he pulled the wire back, the toy sliding along the dusty floor. His breath caught in his throat as the toy horse emerged from the gap. Thomas grabbed it quickly, afraid it might somehow disappear back into the darkness. The toy was dusty and covered in cobwebs, but otherwise intact. It was a simple plastic horse, probably worth just a few pounds, but to a little girl who loved it, the toy was priceless. Thomas sat on the floor of the storage room, holding this small object, and felt an overwhelming sense of relief and accomplishment. He carefully cleaned the toy with a cloth he found on one of the shelves, wiping away the dust and cobwebs until the pink mane shone again. The horse had a cheerful expression painted on its face, and Thomas found himself smiling at it. This was what the prince had asked him to do. This simple, kind gesture that had nothing to do with standing at attention or following protocols. But now came the difficult part. How was he supposed to return the toy? He couldn't just walk up to the royal family's private quarters and knock on the door. That would definitely get him in trouble. He couldn't leave it with another guard, as that would require explaining how he found it and why he had been searching for it in the first place. Thomas left the storage room, carefully closing the blue door behind him. He slipped the toy horse into his jacket pocket and made his way back through the corridors toward the main areas of the castle. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe he could leave it at the front desk with a note. No, that seemed too impersonal. Perhaps he could give it to the maintenance worker to return? But the man had already helped him enough and didn't deserve to be involved further. As Thomas walked, lost in thought, he nearly collided with someone coming around a corner. He stepped back quickly and began to apologize, then froze. Standing before him was Prince George, wearing pajamas and a dressing gown. Behind him was the same nanny from earlier that morning, looking flustered. "Your Royal Highness, you really must return to your room," the nanny was saying. "It's past bedtime and your parents will wonder where you've gone." Prince George ignored her and looked directly at Thomas. The boy's eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he seemed to be assessing Thomas's disheveled appearance. The dust on his pants, the way his hand unconsciously moved to his jacket pocket. "You found it," the prince said simply. It wasn't a question. Thomas hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the toy horse. The prince's face broke into a genuine smile, the kind of pure joy that only children can express so freely. "I knew you would," Prince George said. "Charlotte's been so sad. She loves that horse more than any of her other toys. She calls it Buttons." The nanny stepped forward, clearly confused by what was happening. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. How did you—" "It's a long story," Thomas said quietly. He knelt down so he was at eye level with the prince and held out the toy. "Would you like to give this to your sister? I think it would mean more coming from you." Prince George took the toy carefully, cradling it like the precious object it was to his sister. "Thank you," he said with a sincerity that made Thomas's throat tighten. "You really are a hero. Just like I wrote in my note," Thomas shook his head. "I'm just a guard who helped find a lost toy. That's not being a hero." The young prince looked at him with those wise eyes that seemed far too old for his face. "My grandfather told me that real courage isn't about fighting in battles. It's about doing the right thing even when it's hard or scary or when nobody's watching. You did something you weren't supposed to do because it was right. That's being brave." The words hit Thomas harder than any reprimand from a superior officer ever could. Here was this child, this boy who would one day be king, teaching him lessons about courage and duty that years of military training had never quite captured. The nanny finally found her voice. "I need to take the prince back to his room immediately. This is highly irregular, and I'm not sure what to tell their parents about this encounter." Thomas stood up quickly, suddenly aware of the potential trouble he had caused. "I apologize for any breach of protocol. I was just trying to help." Prince George clutched the toy horse to his chest and looked up at his nanny with pleading eyes. "Please don't get him in trouble. I'm the one who asked for his help. I left him the note because I knew he was kind. I could tell just by looking at him." The nanny's stern expression softened slightly. She had worked for the royal family for many years and had developed a genuine affection for the children in her care. Seeing the prince so earnest and grateful clearly affected her. She sighed deeply and looked at Thomas with a mixture of exasperation and understanding. "What you did was against protocol," she said firmly, "but your intentions were good, and the prince is right that he initiated this situation." She paused, seeming to wrestle with her decision. "I will report this incident, but I will make sure it's clear that you were responding to a request from a member of the royal family. That should provide some protection from serious consequences." Thomas nodded, accepting whatever punishment might come. He had made his choice and he would face the results. "Thank you, ma'am. I understand." Prince George suddenly stepped forward and did something completely unexpected. He reached out and shook Thomas's hand with the formal seriousness of a much older person. "Thank you for your service," the boy said. "Not just for standing guard, but for caring." The nanny gently took the prince's shoulder and guided him back down the corridor. Thomas watched them disappear around the corner, the young prince still clutching the toy horse that would soon bring joy to his sister. Thomas stood alone in the empty corridor, his heart heavy with uncertainty about what would happen next. That night, Thomas barely slept. He lay in his small apartment off base, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. Had he done the right thing? According to the strict military protocols he had sworn to uphold, absolutely not. He had entered a restricted area without authorization, abandoned his proper duties to conduct a personal mission, and had direct contact with a member of the royal family outside of his official capacity. Any one of those infractions could result in disciplinary action. But when he thought about Princess Charlotte's face when she would receive her beloved toy back, when he remembered Prince George's words about courage and doing the right thing, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace that no amount of protocol could shake. For the first time in his 3 years of service, he had connected with the people he was sworn to protect, not as symbols or titles, but as human beings with real emotions and needs. The next morning arrived too quickly. Thomas dressed in his uniform with extra care, making sure everything was perfect. If he was going to face disciplinary proceedings, he would do so looking his best. He arrived at the guardhouse early and found several of his fellow guards already there, their faces serious. Michael approached him immediately. "Thomas, mate, there's been some talk. Word got around about last night. The higher-ups know something happened, but the details are still unclear. You need to be prepared for some difficult questions." Thomas nodded. "I know. I'm ready to accept whatever comes." Before Michael could respond, the door opened and Captain Morrison entered. Captain Morrison was a decorated officer with over 20 years of service. He was known for being fair but strict, a man who valued tradition and discipline above all else. His presence meant that this situation was being taken seriously. "Officer Bennett," the captain's voice was formal and cold. "Please come with me." Thomas followed the captain to a small office. The walk felt endless, each step echoing loudly in the quiet corridors. Inside the office, Captain Morrison gestured for Thomas to sit, then took his own seat behind a desk. Between them lay a folder, presumably containing reports about the previous night's events. "Officer Bennett, I've received some concerning reports about your activities yesterday evening," the captain began. "You were seen in restricted areas of the castle. You entered a storage room without authorization, and you had an unauthorized interaction with members of the royal family. These are serious breaches of protocol. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Thomas sat up straight, meeting the captain's gaze directly. "Sir, everything in those reports is accurate. I did breach protocol. I entered restricted areas, and I did interact with Prince George. I have no excuse except that I was trying to help." Captain Morrison's expression didn't change. "Trying to help is not a defense for breaking the rules that govern our conduct. We are the Queen's Guard, Bennett. We represent centuries of tradition and discipline. When one guard breaks protocol, it reflects on all of us." Thomas felt his career slipping away, but he refused to show regret for his actions. "I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility for my choices." The captain was silent for a long moment, studying Thomas with an unreadable expression. Finally, he opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Before I proceed with disciplinary action, there's something else you should know. This morning we received a letter. It's quite unusual, actually. Would you like to know what it says?" Thomas's heart pounded, but he simply nodded. Captain Morrison began to read aloud. "It's from Princess Catherine, the Princess of Wales. She writes, 'I wish to commend Officer Thomas Bennett for his exceptional service to my family. Yesterday he went above and beyond his assigned duties to help my daughter recover a cherished possession that was causing her considerable distress. His actions demonstrated compassion, initiative, and a genuine care for the well-being of those he is sworn to protect. My son, Prince George, has not stopped talking about Officer Bennett's kindness and courage. While I understand that protocol may have been breached, I believe that the spirit of true service was honored. I hope this letter will be taken into consideration in any proceedings." Thomas sat in stunned silence. He had never expected this, had never imagined that his actions would reach the Princess of Wales herself, let alone result in a letter of commendation. Captain Morrison set the letter down and leaned back in his chair. His stern expression had softened slightly, though he still maintained his authoritative demeanor. "This puts me in a difficult position, Bennett. On one hand, you clearly violated protocol. On the other hand, you have a letter of commendation from a senior member of the royal family. The very people we are sworn to protect are defending you." Thomas found his voice. "Sir, I never intended to cause any trouble or to make your position difficult. I simply saw a chance to help a child, and I took it. If I had to do it again, I would make the same choice." The captain was quiet for another long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. Finally, he spoke. "Your honesty is noted, Bennett, and your conviction is, in its own way, admirable. However, we cannot simply ignore breaches of protocol, even when the intentions are good. If we did, discipline would collapse entirely." Captain Morrison stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Thomas remained seated, his pulse racing as he waited to hear his fate. The office was completely silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Each second felt like an eternity. "Do you know why the protocols exist, Bennett?" the captain asked, still facing the window. Thomas considered the question carefully. "To maintain order, sir. to ensure we perform our duties consistently and reliably, to uphold the traditions that give our service meaning. The captain turned to face him. Those are the textbook answers. But the real reason, the deeper reason, is to protect both the royal family and ourselves. Protocols create boundaries that keep everyone safe. When you crossed into restricted areas, you could have been mistaken for an intruder. When you interacted with the prince without proper supervision, you exposed both yourself and him to potential misunderstandings or accusations. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in these words. I hadn't thought of it that way, sir. That's because you were thinking with your heart instead of your head, Captain Morrison said, his tone less harsh now. Which brings me to an interesting dilemma. A guard who only follows his head becomes a robot, unfeeling and disconnected from the very people he serves. But a guard who only follows his heart becomes unreliable, acting on impulse without considering consequences. The captain returned to his desk and sat down, fixing Thomas with a penetrating stare. The question is, which type of guard are you, Bennett? Thomas thought about the past 24 hours, about Prince George's note, about the toy horse, about the choice he had made. I think, sir, that I'm trying to be both. I want to honor the protocols and traditions that make this service meaningful. But I also want to remember that underneath all the ceremony, we're protecting real people with real lives. A ghost of a smile crossed Captain Morrison's face. That's a more mature answer than I expected. He picked up the letter from Princess Catherine and read it again silently. When he looked back at Thomas, his expression was thoughtful. Here's what's going to happen. Officially, you will receive a formal reprimand for breaching protocol. This will go in your record and will likely delay any potential promotions for at least a year. Thomas felt his heart sink, but he maintained his composure. I understand, sir. However, the captain continued, unofficially, I'm putting you forward for the Queen's commendation for exceptional service. The letter from the Princess of Wales will support this nomination. If approved, it means that while you'll have both a reprimand and a commendation in your file simultaneously, something that's quite rare. Thomas was confused. Sir, I don't understand. How can I be both punished and commended? Captain Morrison leaned forward, his expression earnest. Because life isn't black and white, Bennett. You did something wrong according to the letter of the law, but you did something right according to the spirit of our service. Both things can be true at the same time. The reprimand ensures that other guards don't think they can simply ignore protocol whenever they feel like it. The commendation acknowledges that sometimes the right thing to do exists outside the rigid boundaries of rules. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. Thank you, sir. I'll accept both with humility. There's one more thing, the captain said, pulling out another document. You're being reassigned. Starting next week, you'll be part of a new initiative we're developing. It's a smaller team that will provide security for royal family events where children are present. The thinking is that guards who understand the human element of service, who can balance protocol with compassion, are better suited for situations involving the younger royals. This news was completely unexpected. Thomas had assumed he would be demoted or given less prestigious assignments as punishment. Instead, he was being given a position that sounded more engaging and meaningful than standing at a fixed post for hours. This reassignment isn't a reward, Captain Morrison clarified, reading Thomas's expression. It's a recognition that different situations require different skills. You've demonstrated that you have an ability to connect with the royal children in a way that's both respectful and genuine. That's valuable, but it also means you'll face more complex situations that require quick thinking and good judgment. Thomas absorbed this information, feeling both honored and slightly nervous. I'll do my best to live up to this responsibility, sir. Captain Morrison stood, indicating the meeting was over. I expect you will. Remember, Bennett, what happened yesterday can never happen again in quite that way. If you receive another request from a member of the royal family, no matter how informal, you bring it through proper channels. Is that understood? Completely understood, sir, Thomas replied, standing and saluting. As Thomas left the office, his mind was reeling. In less than 24 hours, his entire career trajectory had shifted. He had gone from a standard guard performing routine duties to someone recognized by both the Princess of Wales and his commanding officer. Yet he also had a formal reprimand that would follow him throughout his service. Michael was waiting outside, trying to look casual while obviously dying to know what had happened. When Thomas emerged, his friend rushed over.
Well, are you being discharged?
Demoted, put on permanent latrine duty? Thomas couldn't help but smile. It's complicated. I'm being both punished and promoted, apparently. Michael's eyebrows shot up. How is that even possible? As they walked back to the guardhouse, Thomas explained everything that had happened in the captain's office. Michael listened with increasing amazement, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. So let me get this straight, Michael said when Thomas finished. You break protocol, get caught, receive a letter of support from the Princess of Wales, get a reprimand, get nominated for a commendation, and get reassigned to a special unit. Mate, your life is like something out of a storybook. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. It doesn't feel like a storybook. It feels messy and complicated and uncertain. That's because it is, Michael said wisely. But here's what I know about you, Thomas. You did what you thought was right, and you were willing to face the consequences. That takes guts. Most people talk about doing the right thing, but when it actually costs them something, they back down. You didn't. Those words meant more to Thomas than any official commendation could. Respect from a fellow soldier, someone who understood the weight of the choice he had made, was precious. The following days were strange for Thomas. News of the incident had spread through the guard, though the details were fuzzy and growing more exaggerated with each retelling. Some guards treated him like a hero, others viewed him with suspicion as if he had somehow cheated the system by getting royal support. Thomas tried to ignore both reactions and simply focus on his remaining duties before the reassignment. On his last day at his old post, something remarkable happened. Thomas was standing at attention in his usual spot when he heard familiar footsteps approaching. He kept his eyes forward, but his peripheral vision caught sight of not one, but three small figures. Prince George appeared first, walking with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Behind him came Princess Charlotte, a tiny girl with long hair and a bright smile. She was clutching the toy horse Buttons tightly in one hand, and bringing up the rear was Prince Louis, the youngest, who was being gently guided by the same nanny Thomas had encountered before. The children stopped in front of Thomas's post. He remained perfectly still, maintaining his professional stance, but inside his heart was pounding. What were they doing here? Prince George spoke first, his voice clear and formal. Officer Bennett, on behalf of my sister, I wish to thank you for your service. It was clearly a practice speech, probably coached by their parents, but the sentiment was genuine. Princess Charlotte stepped forward, looking up at Thomas with wide, grateful eyes. She held up the toy horse. You found Buttons, she said in a small, sweet voice. He's my favorite. Thank you for bringing him home. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. He wasn't supposed to speak or react while on duty, but this was an exceptional circumstance. He allowed himself the slightest smile and a tiny nod, breaking protocol in the smallest way possible. Prince Louis, not fully understanding what was happening but wanting to participate, suddenly waved enthusiastically at Thomas. The gesture was so pure and innocent that several guards watching from a distance couldn't help but smile. The nanny gently ushered the children away, but Prince George paused and looked back. He gave Thomas a small, knowing nod, a gesture of respect between two people who understood each other. Then they were gone, disappearing into the castle. Thomas remained at his post, maintaining his stance for the rest of his shift, but something fundamental had changed inside him. He understood now that being a guard was about more than just standing still or following orders. It was about being a bridge between tradition and humanity, between protocol and compassion. That evening, as Thomas packed up his belongings from his locker in the guardhouse, he found an envelope that hadn't been there before. His name was written on it in elegant handwriting. Inside was a simple card with the royal seal. The message was brief. True service comes from the here. Thomas began his new assignment on a crisp Monday morning in October. The specialized unit he was joining consisted of only 8 guards, all hand-selected for their ability to balance security concerns with the more relaxed atmosphere needed around children. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a no-nonsense woman with 15 years of experience who had previously served in protection details for various dignitaries. The first briefing was held in a small conference room that Thomas had never been to before. The other 7 guards were already seated when he arrived, and he noticed they were sizing him up with curious expressions. News of his incident had clearly reached them. Lieutenant Chen began the meeting without preamble. For those who don't know, this is Officer Thomas Bennett. He's joining our team based on a recommendation from Captain Morrison and, interestingly enough, from the Princess of Wales herself. She gave Thomas a look that was both welcoming and challenging. That's quite an endorsement, Bennett. I hope you can live up to it. Thomas felt his face flush. I'll do my best, ma'am. One of the other guards, a friendly-looking woman named Officer Patricia Hughes, spoke up. We heard you went rogue to find a kid's toy. That true? The room fell silent. Thomas could feel everyone waiting for his response. He decided honesty was the best approach. I responded to a request for help from Prince George. The method I used wasn't proper protocol, and I've been formally reprimanded for it. But yes, I retrieved Princess Charlotte's lost toy. Another guard, Officer James Foster, leaned back in his chair with a slight smile. And got a letter from the princess for your trouble. Not bad for a day's work? Lieutenant Chen cut off any further discussion with a sharp gesture. What's past is past. We're here to discuss how this unit operates. Unlike standard guard duty, we don't simply stand at fixed posts. We move with the royal children during approved outings, events, and activities. This means you need to be alert, flexible, and capable of making quick decisions while always maintaining appropriate boundaries. Over the next hour, Lieutenant Chen outlined the unit's responsibilities. They would provide security during the children's visits to schools, charity events, and other public appearances. They would maintain a protective perimeter without being intrusive. They would need to identify potential threats while allowing the children to have as normal an experience as possible. The challenge, Lieutenant Chen explained, is that these children are not just symbols or duties. They're real kids who need protection, but they also need space to grow and learn. Parents trust us to keep their children safe. In this case, those parents happen to be the future king and queen. The pressure is immense, but the work is rewarding. Thomas found himself genuinely excited about this assignment. It was so different from standing motionless at a post for hours. This required active engagement and constant awareness. The unit's first assignment came 3 days later. Prince George and Princess Charlotte were scheduled to visit a local primary school as part of a literacy initiative. The children would read with students, participate in activities, and be photographed by a carefully vetted pool of journalists. Thomas and 3 other guards arrived at the school hours before the royal children were scheduled to appear. They checked every entrance, evaluated sight lines, and coordinated with local police. The school's staff were nervous and excited, rushing around to make sure everything was perfect. When the royal car finally arrived, Thomas felt his stomach tighten with nerves. This was his first real assignment with the new unit, and he desperately wanted to prove he belonged. Prince George and Princess Charlotte emerged from the car, both dressed in smart casual clothes and looking slightly overwhelmed by the attention. Thomas took his position near the entrance, maintaining a respectful distance while keeping the children in his line of sight. As they entered the school, Prince George's eyes scanned the guards and landed on Thomas. A flicker of recognition crossed the boy's face, followed by the smallest smile. The visit went smoothly. The royal children were charming and natural with the school students, reading stories and answering questions with the poise that had been trained into them since birth. Thomas watched with admiration as they navigated the attention and expectations placed on their young shoulders. About halfway through the visit, something unexpected happened. A school fire alarm suddenly began blaring, filling the building with harsh, startling noise. The children in the room immediately began to panic, some covering their ears, others starting to cry. The teachers tried to maintain order, but the surprise had thrown everyone into confusion. The guards immediately went into action. Lieutenant Chen spoke quickly into her radio, confirming whether this was a real emergency or a false alarm. Thomas moved closer to Prince George and Princess Charlotte, ready to evacuate them if necessary. But he noticed something that made him pause. Princess Charlotte had frozen in place, her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. The loud alarm was clearly overwhelming her. Prince George was trying to comfort his sister, but he looked frightened himself. The school children around them were being ushered toward the exits by their teachers, but the royal children seemed paralyzed by the chaos. Thomas made a split-second decision. He knelt down beside the children, making himself less intimidating, and spoke in a calm, quiet voice that somehow cut through the noise. "Your Royal Highnesses, everything is going to be all right. This is just a loud noise, nothing more. We're going to walk together to the door, nice and slowly. Can you do that for me?" Prince George looked at Thomas with recognition and trust. "It's very loud," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I know," Thomas replied. "But you're brave, remember? And your sister needs you to be brave for her right now." Those words seemed to flip a switch in the young prince. He straightened up, took his sister's hand, and nodded. "Come on, Charlotte. We can do this." Thomas walked beside them toward the exit, maintaining his protective stance while also providing a calming presence. Other guards had formed a protective circle around them, but Thomas was the one the children were focusing on, drawing strength from his steady demeanor. Once outside, Lieutenant Chen received confirmation that it had been a false alarm, likely triggered by someone accidentally pulling the alarm lever. The situation was resolved, and after a brief delay, the visit continued inside. Later, when the children were safely back in their car and headed home, Lieutenant Chen pulled Thomas aside. "That was good work in there, Bennett. You kept the children calm and got them out safely without causing additional panic. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in this unit." Thomas felt a surge of pride but tried to remain humble. "Thank you, ma'am. I just tried to remember that they're children first, royal second." Lieutenant Chen gave him an approving nod. "That's the right priority. But don't let your guard down. The rapport you've built with Prince George in particular is valuable, but it can't compromise your professional judgment." Over the following weeks, Thomas settled into his new role. Each assignment was different and brought its own challenges. There was a visit to a children's hospital where Princess Charlotte became upset seeing sick children, and Thomas had to help redirect her attention while maintaining security. There was a charity football match where Prince George was knocked down during play, and the guards had to quickly assess whether he was injured while allowing him the dignity of getting up on his own. Through it all, Thomas found himself developing a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve. Standing at attention had been about discipline and endurance. This new role required empathy, quick thinking, and the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives simultaneously. 6 months after Thomas joined the specialized unit, he received an unexpected summons. He was to report to Buckingham Palace for a ceremony, but the details were vague. When he arrived, dressed in his full ceremonial uniform, he found Michael waiting for him outside the main hall. "What are you doing here?" Thomas asked, surprised to see his friend. Michael grinned. "Same as you, I expect. Got mysterious orders to show up in my best uniform, though I suspect you know more about what's happening than I do." Before Thomas could respond, they were ushered inside along with about 20 other guards and palace staff. The hall was impressive, with high ceilings and portraits of past monarchs looking down at them. At the far end of the room stood the Prince and Princess of Wales along with their 3 children. Thomas's heart began to race. He had continued to see Prince George and Princess Charlotte during various assignments, but always in professional contexts. This formal setting was different, more serious, and he had no idea what was about to happen. A palace official stepped forward and called for everyone's attention. "We are gathered here today for a special presentation. Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, wishes to personally recognize members of the palace staff and security who have demonstrated exceptional service to the royal family." The ceremony began with several staff members being called forward to receive certificates and small gifts. Thomas watched and applauded politely, still uncertain why he had been summoned. Then he heard his name. "Officer Thomas Bennett, please step forward." Thomas walked to the front of the hall, his legs feeling strangely unsteady. The Princess of Wales smiled warmly at him, and up close, he could see that her expression was genuinely kind, not just formally polite. "Officer Bennett," she began, her voice clear and confident. "6 months ago, you took it upon yourself to help my daughter recover something precious to her. In doing so, you demonstrated that true service comes not from blindly following rules, but from understanding the spirit behind those rules, which is to protect and care for people, not just positions or titles." She paused, and Thomas noticed that Prince George was holding something behind his back, trying hard to keep still despite his obvious excitement. The princess continued, "Since joining the Children's Security Unit, you have consistently shown good judgment, compassion, and professionalism. My husband and I have watched you navigate challenging situations with grace and wisdom. You have earned not just our respect, but the trust of our children, which is far more difficult to achieve." Prince George stepped forward, bringing his hands from behind his back to reveal a small wooden box. He handed it to his mother, who opened it to reveal a custom medal. It wasn't an official military decoration, but rather a personal commendation created specifically for this occasion. "This is the royal family's Personal Recognition Award," the princess explained. "It's rarely given, and it comes directly from our family to acknowledge service that has touched our lives in a meaningful way." She pinned the medal to Thomas's uniform, and then did something completely unexpected. She extended her hand for a handshake, a gesture of equal respect that broke formal protocol. Thomas shook her hand, overwhelmed with emotion. Prince George couldn't contain himself any longer. "You're still my favorite guard," he whispered loudly, causing several people in the room to chuckle. Princess Charlotte, standing next to her brother, was clutching Buttons, her toy horse, and she gave Thomas a shy wave. The Princess of Wales smiled at her son's enthusiasm before addressing the room again. "Let Officer Bennett's example remind all of us that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. When we lose sight of the human beings behind the protocols, we lose sight of why we serve at all." As Thomas returned to his place, the room erupted in applause. He caught Michael's eye and saw his friend grinning proudly. Other guards he had served with over the years were nodding in approval. Even some who had been skeptical of him now looked at him with respect. After the ceremony concluded, Thomas was preparing to leave when Prince George approached him, having apparently slipped away from his nanny's watchful eye for just a moment. "Officer Bennett," the young prince said formally. Then his composure broke into a genuine smile. "Thomas, can I call you that when we're not in public?" Thomas knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. "When we're in private settings like this, yes, Your Royal Highness." Prince George nodded seriously. "I wanted to tell you something. My father said that what you did, finding Charlotte's toy, was important because you treated us like we mattered as people, not just as royals. He said that's easy to forget when everyone treats you differently because of who you are." The boy's words carried a weight that seemed far beyond his years. Thomas realized that this child, who would someday be king, was already learning the loneliness that could come with his position. The way people often saw the title before the person. "You do matter as people," Thomas said quietly. "You're a kind, thoughtful young man who cares about his sister. That's who you are, regardless of any titles." Prince George smiled, a genuine expression of relief and happiness. "That's why I wrote you that note. I could tell you saw us that way." The nanny appeared then, gently but firmly guiding the prince back to his family. Thomas stood and watched him go, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the strange path that had led him to this moment. Later that evening, Thomas sat in his apartment, the medal resting on his table. He took out the original note from Prince George, now carefully preserved in a frame, and read it again. The simple words of a child had changed his entire life, had taught him lessons about courage and service that years of training had never quite captured. His phone buzzed with a message from Michael. "Drinks tomorrow to celebrate?" "You've earned it, hero." Thomas smiled and replied, "I'm not a hero. Just a guard who learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is care." Over the following years, Thomas continued his service with the Children's Security Unit. He was there when Prince George started at a new school, providing security but also a familiar, comforting face. He was present at Princess Charlotte's first public speech, ready to intervene if she became overwhelmed but proud when she handled it beautifully on her own. He watched Prince Louis grow from a toddler into a curious, energetic boy who kept all the guards on their toes. Thomas never forgot the lesson he had learned that day when Prince George left him a note. Rules and protocols were important, but they were tools to serve a greater purpose. The moment you valued the rules more than the people they were meant to protect, you had lost sight of your true duty. He eventually rose to become the head of the Children's Security Unit, a position he held with humility and dedication. He trained new guards not just in security procedures, but in empathy and good judgment. He told them about finding a toy horse, about breaking protocol, about being both reprimanded and commended, about learning that courage sometimes looks like kneeling down to comfort a frightened child. And in his office, in a simple frame next to his various commendations and medals, Thomas kept that original note. Visitors often asked about it, and he would tell them the story of a young prince who taught a guard what it truly meant to serve. Years later, when Prince George was a teenager preparing for his future role, he requested a meeting with Thomas. They sat in a private room, and the young man, now tall and poised, spoke with the wisdom of someone who had spent his life learning what leadership meant. "I wanted to thank you properly," Prince George said. "I was just a child when I wrote that note. But you took it seriously. You showed me that people in positions of power and responsibility should listen to everyone, even children. Because sometimes the simplest observations contain the deepest truths." Thomas felt his eyes mist with tears. "Your Royal Highness, I should be thanking you. You changed my life with that note. You taught me what service really means." Prince George smiled. "We taught each other, I think. That's what the best relationships do." As Thomas walked out of that meeting, he reflected on the incredible journey that had started with a folded piece of paper and a lost toy horse. He had entered the Queen's Guard seeking honor and tradition, and he had found those things. But he had also discovered something more valuable: the understanding that true strength comes from compassion, real courage comes from caring, and the highest form of service is recognizing the humanity in everyone you meet. The hidden gesture from Prince George hadn't just stunned the royal guard that day. It had transformed him, teaching lessons that would ripple forward through years of service, touching countless lives and reminding everyone who heard the story that sometimes the most important acts of bravery are the quietest ones, performed not on battlefields or in grand ceremonies, but in the simple choice to help another person, regardless of what the rules might say. And somewhere in Windsor Castle, a little girl still played with a toy horse named Buttons, never knowing that her beloved toy had sparked a change in how at least one guard understood his duty, his purpose, and the true meaning of protection.